All right, welcome back to the party, everybody. This is Morty, and I am your host, Lutch, aka the Indian Jesus, here to resurrect the second coming of common sense. How's everybody doing tonight? Big shout out to the replay gang. He's gone already. Thank you so much for coming back to check this out, even though you missed the live party. Guys, that is the best part. So make sure you are here every Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 8 p.m. Eastern, and sometimes whenever I feel like it. I did a full show yesterday, so make sure you hit that subscribe, and you will never ever have to worry about missing an Indian Jesus live party ever again. Let's also say thank you to mysickshirt.com. Whatever your persuasion, they've got something for you. And of course, it is the only place to get your very own The Indian Jesus official merch. Only at mysickshirt.com. All right. What is good? We got Theon Greyjoy in the building. Welcome to the party. Oh, man. Oh, Reek. Welcome. So, interesting show that I have for you guys today. Usually, we are diving into a discussion, a debate, a podcast, something like that, and two people are talking, and they are, we're trying to determine the value of each person's contribution to that conversation. Today, I want to do something a little bit different. We're going to take a step back, and we're going to kind of take an overview look at how we should be looking at any of these episodes and understanding, just in general, how to analyze arguments like a philosopher. So we're going to go through here. It's a little bit drier than stuff that we normally go over, but hopefully I can make it fun for you. So, Theon was never good at debates. Hopefully after this, you will be a master debater. As always, if you cannot hear the video, please do let me know.
Picture this. It's Thanksgiving Day. Picture this. It's Thanksgiving Day, and you're seated around the dining table with your family.
Hey, Michael. No, I did not.
Uncle Jim Bob, fresh from binging Tucker Carlson for hours last night, is seated at the end of the table.
Yo, he really does look like Jared. Oh, my God. All right, good one. Oh, man.
Despite fiascos from years past, your mother insists on seating your cousin Eli, a passionate environmentalist, next to Uncle Jim Bob. She says she wants the seating arrangement to forge a new beginning in the rocky relationship between Eli and Uncle Jim Bob. As the meal progresses, things go relatively smoothly, until Uncle Jim Bob confidently touts the cold weather outside as disproof of global warming. Naturally enough, Eli can't help himself, so he explains to Uncle Jim Bob that just because local variations result in cold weather, that doesn't mean the climate isn't warming. Climate, after all, is different from weather. Uncle Jim Bob retorts, Eli follows suit, they go back and forth, and soon enough they're throwing mashed potatoes at one another. This is what we often think of when we think of an argument. But it's only an argument in the sense of a heated exchange between disagreeing parties. There's another understanding of arguments, however, that interests philosophers. On this understanding, an argument is a collection of statements, one of which is known as the conclusion, and the rest of which, known as the premises, are offered in support of that conclusion.
So that's the first important thing there to understand, that an argument is made up of a bunch of statements. One of those statements is the conclusion, the actual thing that you're handing over, the thing that you're talking about, the thing that you're trying to say, and all the other things are sentences or statements that would back that up.
It's this sort of argument that concerns us in this video. Now, arguments have a variety of purposes. Sometimes they're offered to persuade others of the relevant conclusion. Other times they're offered simply to clarify the logical relationships between claims. And still other times they're offered to show that a certain collection of statements has an interesting, potentially unforeseen consequence, one which might be welcomed with opening arms, or one which might force belief revision, if, for instance, the conclusion is either an absurdity or a contradiction derived from premises that you accept. But while there are lots of different purposes one might have in mounting an argument, there's actually a formulaic, step-by-step process that you can use to analyze and evaluate basically any argument that comes your way.
So that's really what we're going to be doing. He's going to break this down. He's got an awesome outline PowerPoint thing here, and I really think we can learn a lot from it. So Revenge of the Nerds. That's exactly right. We need to become the nerds and get revenge. That's what we need to do.
And it's that process that I'm going to be teaching you in this video. Whether you're a student of philosophy or just a curious thinker, mastering the art of analyzing and assessing arguments will empower you to understand philosophical debates, increase your stock of true beliefs, decrease your stock of false beliefs, help you detect bullshit, and ultimately navigate the grand landscape of ideas.
And isn't that all we want? Isn't that all we want is to understand what is true and what should we do? That's it.
With clarity and precision. My goal in this video, in short, is to empower you.
Empower me, baby.
Again, I'm going to equip you with a step-by-step guide for analyzing and assessing
Facts.
arguments.
Shout out to the nerds.
Before getting into step 1, though, here's a bird's eye view of all the steps together, which will help orient us as we proceed through each step. So step 1 is to clarify and define terms. Step 2 is to formulate the argument, which consists of 4 sub-steps.
So this is the
First,
outline
determine the
that he's going to be using throughout the whole thing. So we'll just let him go through the bird's eye view here.
Kind of argument at play. Second, find the main conclusion of the argument. Third, find the premises of the argument. And finally, put the argument in premise-by-premise form. The third step is to determine whether the conclusion follows from the premises. In the fourth step, you examine each premise's justification. This consists in 3 steps in turn. First, assess the epistemic merits of the reasons. Second, assess the connection between the reasons and the premise that they're offered on behalf of. And third, assess the dialectical merits of the reasons. The 5th step is to see if there are reasons to think the premises are false. And the 6th and final step is to be intellectually virtuous.
That one is probably the most important one. Be intellectually virtuous. All that really means is that you're coming to the table under the pretenses that you are saying. If you're saying, I'm here to have a conversation about whether or not trans people exist, as long as you are legitimately trying to have that conversation and you are saying things in the manner that you actually think them, then you're being intellectually honest. If you're trying to score points on the other person or make the other person look dumb or, use underhanded techniques to make your side look better or stuff like that, that would be intellectually dishonest or not intellectually virtuous.
Throughout this whole process. Let's begin then with step 1.
All
clarify
right,
and
step
define
1.
terms. So for any argumentative piece you encounter, whether it's a video, book, article, blog, podcast, whatever, the central argument being developed will probably employ some crucial terms, concepts, distinctions, and the like.
That's why any good debater, when the first thing that they will do is to define terms. What do you mean when you say this? What do you mean by that? When I say this, I mean X, Y, and Z. Because if we don't know what we're talking about, then we can't have a productive conversation.
The first step in analyzing an argument, then, is to get clear on these various terms, concepts, and distinctions operative in the argument. Now, quite often, it's not going to be feasible to obtain clean, necessary, and sufficient conditions for the application of the various terms or concepts operative in the argument. By the way, a necessary condition for the application of a term is a condition that needs to be met for a term to apply to something, whereas a sufficient condition is a condition which, when met by something, suffices for the term to apply to that thing.
Right.
So, for instance,
So the difference between a necessary condition and a sufficient condition is what he's about to go into.
A man is a necessary condition for being a bachelor, since one can't be a bachelor without being a man. In other words, one
Oh man, yeah, you took a beating in that one.
needs to be a man to be a bachelor.
So I want to back that up actually.
Since being a man is a necessary condition for being a bachelor, since one can't be a bachelor without being a man. In other words, one needs to be a man to be a bachelor. But being a man certainly isn't sufficient for being a bachelor, since one can be a man even though one isn't a bachelor.
And another way to think about that is sufficient conditions are going to fall under necessary conditions, but necessary conditions aren't necessarily going to fall under sufficient conditions. So, all bachelors are men, but not all men are bachelors. All toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. So one is the necessary condition and one is the sufficient.
My dad is a clear example here. But anyway, back to my point, which is that often we won't have necessary and sufficient conditions that provide the meaning or application conditions for the terms, distinctions, and concepts within an argument. Still, though, for any crucial terms and distinctions and concepts whose meaning might not be obvious or might admit of multiple interpretations, it's incumbent to flesh out, to some suitable degree, their meanings within the argument. In short, then, the first step consists in simply defining, or at least getting clear on, the relevant terms and concepts and distinctions at play in an argument.
Hey, we got unwanted foe in the building. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the party with the $5 super chat. And of course, you know that every super chat comes with a treat for Morty. And that makes you the new sponsor of the stream. Welcome, welcome, welcome to the party.
The purpose of all this is to prevent merely verbal disputes, since those are largely unproductive and besides the substantive points at issue in most debates. Another purpose is to prevent ambiguity and equivocation within the argument. And overall, when we get clear on terms, that allows us to assess how plausible the premises containing those terms are. And this is the first step because it's kind of a necessary preamble to further engaging an argument, right? If we don't know what the crucial terms in an argument mean, if in other words, we don't have a good grasp of what its premises and or conclusion are even saying, then there's not much use in proceeding further.
Exactly. Like I said, if we don't know what we're talking about, then there's no point in having a conversation. Hey, we got Melted Mind Media in the building. What is good? What is good? Another awesome YouTuber. Welcome to the party. I just dropped the link to his channel. Please definitely go check him out. Welcome, brother. Welcome, welcome, welcome.
But before we proceed further to the second step of analyzing an argument, we should ask, how do we even assess definitions in the first place? Now, sometimes people will offer stipulative definitions, and in those cases, there really isn't much to assess. Other times, however, people are trying to capture what it is to be something, say what it is to be omnipotent, or what knowledge is. Or perhaps they're simply trying to capture the linguistic meaning of a term.
Right. So if we're talking about what actually is knowledge, then we have to define the terms that go around that. You know, when we talk about our brain and our mind, then we have to, okay, well, when you say your mind, is that the same thing as your brain, or are we separating them? How are we assessing these definitions?
In so doing, they'll typically give an analysis of the following sort. X is F if and only if such and such condition holds. So X is something, F is some predicate which applies to the thing. It's like, hey, something is omnipotent if and only if such and such holds. Or some subject knows something if and only if such and such holds.
So an example, we could say if X is Morty and F is fed. X is fed if and only if the condition holds, being that there is a new super chat. So we know that if Morty is getting fed on camera, the only way he's getting fed is if there is a super chat. And as we just saw, shout out to Unwanted Foe, just prove that for us. So that is the structure of how this thought is going forward. Think of it like a math equation.
When you say X is F if such and such a condition holds, you're saying that such and such holding is a sufficient condition for X being F. And when you say that X is F only if such and such a condition holds, you're saying that that condition is necessary for X being F. When someone gives an analysis of this sort, we can assess their analysis by first seeing if something could be F, even though that condition here doesn't hold. If so, then their analysis is simply mistaken, since its claim that such and such holding is necessary for being F is then simply false.
Hey, shout out to Theon for subscribing. Thank you, brother. I'm trying to decide if I want to keep the captions on for this one, because it's very wordy, but there's a lot of words on screen. So I'll leave it where it is for now, but you guys let me know if it gets a little confusing.
Right, because something can be F without this condition holding, so that's not necessary for something being F. We can also assess an analysis by seeing if that condition could hold even though something isn't F.
Yeah, let's try with that.
If so, then their analysis is again mistaken, since its claim that that condition is sufficient for being F is simply false. Third, any such analysis should be illuminating, in the sense that the notions it employs within the analysis shouldn't be more...
That wasn't just me, right? Was that my microphone, or did the video just get a bit louder?
...more mysterious, or less clear, or less understandable than the notion being analyzed. And finally, any such analysis should be non-circular, in that it shouldn't analyze a notion by employing that very notion for which we sought an analysis.
Like, a trans woman is a woman if and only if she thinks she's a woman. What? That would be a circular argument.
Right, like it wouldn't be a good analysis of knowledge to say that some subject knows that P, if and only if They believe that P, and that belief counts as knowledge. Like,
we literally just said the same thing, but he just used the variables. Listen to what I just said. A woman is a woman is any person who thinks that they are a woman. Now listen to what he said and tell me it's not the exact same equation.
Analysis, right? Like, it wouldn't be a good analysis of knowledge to say that some subject knows that P, if and only if they believe that
Oh, come on.
P, and that belief counts as knowledge. Like, no, that's a circular analysis. You employed the notion of knowledge in your account of knowledge.
Exactly.
All right, so that was just a brief crash course on how to assess definitions and analyses when they're non-stipulative. But stepping back, when we've gotten clear on the terms and concepts and distinctions within an argument, and when we've adequately assessed any analyses being offered to capture the essence of something or the linguistic meaning of some term or the application conditions for a term or concept, once we've done all that, we can then proceed to the second step of argument analysis, which is to formulate the argument.
So remember, the argument is just the collection of statements, the collection of ideas that leads to the final one. So how do you formulate that argument?
So at this point, we've achieved some clarity on the various notions at play in the argument. It's time to actually formulate the argument in premise by premise form. Doing so makes it super easy to pinpoint exactly where an argument's strengths and weaknesses are.
And this is why people who understand this are very good at, just listening to a very convoluted argument and being able to pinpoint exactly why it's wrong, exactly why it doesn't make sense, exactly why it's a bad analogy, so on and so forth. Because as you're listening, and as time goes on, you get better at this. As you're listening, you're filtering in what the person is saying into that X, if and only if P, whatever the formula is. You're plugging in the variables that they're giving you, and seeing if it all checks out.
And it'll also make you incredibly precise in your assessment of the argument, since you'll be able to locate exactly which step in the argument is problematic. Say, a particular premise, or perhaps the relationship between the premises and the conclusion. Now, there are actually 4 substeps within this step. The first substep is to determine what kind of argument is being presented. Arguments, after all, come in many different kinds, many different varieties, many different forms.
Sure.
In some of them, the truth of the premises is supposed to guarantee the truth of the conclusion, in the sense that it's impossible for the premises to be true while the conclusion is false. These are known as deductive arguments. More precisely, in a deductive argument, the premises are supposed to logically entail the conclusion. It's logically necessary that if the premises are true, then the conclusion is also true. It's supposed to be literally logically inconsistent to assert all the premises and yet deny the conclusion. In doing so, one would simply contradict oneself. And so in that sense,
I'm trying to see if he's going to give an example.
Deductive argument, it's supposed to be the case that if all the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. Right? If the conclusion weren't also true when all the premises are true, then we'd have a contradiction on our hands. This is what it means for the truth of the premises to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. An example of a deductive argument could be something like this. Premise 1, if I'm in Indiana, then I'm in the United States. Premise 2, I'm in Indiana. So 3, I'm in the United States.
Perfect. We have a perfect deductive argument. If I am in Indiana, then I am in the United States. That is an idea. That is a true idea. Then you go to the second premise. I'm in Indiana. Then Melty's in Indiana. So then you go to premise, or you go to the conclusion, which is, so therefore, I'm in the United States. I know that because I cannot be in Indiana without being in the United States. Sorry, buddy.
Here, it cannot be the case that the premises are true while the conclusion is false.
It cannot be the case. It cannot be the case that the premises are, that the conclusion, the bottom line, it cannot be the case that this is true if any of these are false. So this could be sound logic in the sense that it is true that if I'm in Indiana, then I'm in the United States. But if I was making this argument versus if Melted Mind Media was making this argument, either way, it's a sound argument, but the validity of an argument has to do with whether or not it's true. Because this is a good argument. But the fact of the matter is, I am not in Indiana. So it would not be true if I was laying out this argument. So the logic is sound, meaning internally it all makes sense. But validity has to do with reality.
Given that these two premises are true, the conclusion logically and inescapably follows. It's literally contradictory for both of the premises to be true and yet the conclusion to be false. That's the goal of a deductive argument. By contrast, non-deductive arguments are simply arguments which are not deductive. That is, the truth of a non-deductive argument's premises does not guarantee the truth of its conclusion. Instead, the truth of the premises is meant to merely probabilistically support the truth of the conclusion, either by raising its probability or else by making it likely to be true. In non-deductive arguments, it's not logically impossible for all the premises to be true while the conclusion is false. In other words, it could be the case, in principle, that all the premises are true, even though the conclusion is false. There's nothing inconsistent or contradictory about that.
And that's what I was saying about the difference between soundness and validity.
Still, though, the premises are meant to probabilistically support the conclusion in some way. Now, there are lots of different kinds of non-deductive arguments. So simple inductive arguments, for instance, go something like this. 1, all observed f's have property p. So probably 2, all f's have property p. Right, so like all observed physical objects obey the law of gravity, so probably all physical objects obey the law of gravity.
Or something a little bit more simple, all observed men have penises, so probably all men have penises. Works out.
In an argument like this, the proponent of the argument will often explicitly conclude that it's simply probable that all f's are G.
Right, because then somebody could say, well, actually, this is a trans man, and they are a man, but they don't have a penis. And that's when we get into the argument, like, okay, well, what do we mean by man? And why it's important to define your terms.
Since people often want to signal that they intend to present a non-deductive argument. And of course, keep in mind that you can kind of turn any non-deductive argument into a deductive argument if you add a premise which just says, hey, if all those premises are true, then the conclusion is true. Well, yeah, sure. Then in that case, given the truth of all those premises, namely all the original premises plus that linking premise that I just mentioned, that conditional claim, yeah, those premises altogether guarantee the truth of the conclusion. So anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself, and if that didn't make too much sense, don't worry about it. All right, another kind of non-deductive argument is an abductive argument. It's also called abduction or inference to the best explanation, which is a form of reasoning wherein we conclude that the best explanation or account of some range of phenomena is probably true. More specifically, it takes the following form. For some collection of evidence, a specific hypothesis not only provides a good explanation of that evidence, but explains the evidence better than any available rival hypothesis. And from that, we conclude that probably the specified hypothesis is true.
So again, if you want to take something like the dating app information and how often women swipe left, which is a no, swipe left on men versus how often men swipe left, then you could say for we collected this amount of data, and we're going to extrapolate from this data. So it's probably true, but we don't know for a fact because we haven't checked with everybody's dating a specific dating app. The larger the sample. So if you do a sample of 100 people and you collect evidence from there, the probably that leads to the hypothesis is true. The probably is going to be a lot weaker than if you gathered information from 10,000 people, and stronger probably with 1 million people, and so on and so forth.
Now, there are lots of other kinds of non-deductive arguments, but that suffices for present purposes. The first substep, again, just urges us to identify the kind of argument at play, since evaluating an argument requires understanding the intended relationship between its premises and its conclusion.
Yeah, basically, if you the type of argument is going to dictate the type of or I guess the style of argument is going to dictate the path with which you go towards trying to reach your conclusion or convince the other person.
If the premises aren't intended to guarantee the truth of the conclusion, for instance, then it would be silly to criticize the argument on account of its premises failing to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. That's not what the argument was meant to do in the first place. So that's why this is the first step here. You need to determine the kind of argument at hand. But once you've done that, you can move on to the second substep, which is to find the main conclusion. Now, identifying the main conclusion being argued for at this stage is crucial, since it orients you well prior to locating the reasons or premises that are supposed to be building up towards this ultimate conclusion.
You basically want to know, what is the bottom line? What is the bottom line? What are we doing here? What are we talking about? What is happening?
Right? Most often, the premises are there for the sake of the conclusion. And so identifying the conclusion will help you better formulate the premises and the structural relationships between them that are needed in order to deliver the conclusion. How do you identify the main conclusion, you ask? Well, oftentimes it'll be obvious, but when it's not, you can use conclusion indicators. These are certain common phrases that signal or indicate when an author is drawing a conclusion. These are going to be words like so, therefore, hence, accordingly.
So whenever somebody uses one of these words and then says a thing, then that's them typically making a claim. So now you can take that you believe this to be true. Then you can filter that through your own mind and think about, okay, this part works, but that part doesn't. Well, what about this? And that's how you start a conversation.
Thus, consequently. Because of this, it follows that as a result, for this reason, this means that, we can conclude that, which implies that, or entails that, or shows that, etc. Right. When these sorts of words show up, your eyes should light up, since they almost invariably mean that the author is drawing a conclusion or making an inference from what's gone before. Now, do be wary of intermediate conclusions. These are like little sub-conclusions that are reached along the way in building up to the main or ultimate conclusion, and which are often used as premises that, together with other premises, lead to the ultimate conclusion.
Like if someone were to say, well, we know that gender is just a social construct, so it doesn't really matter how you identify. Therefore, a male can become a female.
What?
That don't work. That's not logical.
Usually sub-conclusions occur when a conclusion indicator word is used in, like, the middle of a paragraph, and after which further reasons or premises are presented, which, together with that sub-conclusion within the middle of the paragraph, lead to the ultimate conclusion. Again, that's just a general trend. There are lots of different exceptions, etc. My point here is just to be wary. Be wary of intermediate conclusions, because they're different from the ultimate or main conclusion of an argument. Now, once you've identified the main conclusion, the next task in the next substep is to identify the premises being used to support or lead to that conclusion. These are basically the reasons put forward on behalf of the conclusion, or at the very least, they're claims from which the conclusion is supposed to follow.
And these are going to be a lot more difficult to point out. They're not. They don't necessarily come with a prefix, but it's going to be important, especially if you already know the conclusion. Then you can, again, by listening and understanding that this is how people are forming this in their minds, even if they're not aware of it, that you can kind of backtrack it and say, okay, if you think this, then and you got here because of that, then it's likely, you can understand where they're coming from.
Right. Remember, not every argument's purpose is to convince others of the conclusion. So the relevant premises might not actually be intended to lend support to the conclusion. They might be simply employed to show that a particular conclusion follows from someone's beliefs or else from an abstract set of claims. Right. So just keep in mind, again, that arguments have variegated purposes. So how do you find the premises in an argument? Well, I'm glad you asked, because much like in the case of finding the conclusion, there are often premise indicators, which are words or phrases that signal the introduction of a premise within a chain of reasoning. They'll typically be things like since, because, for, as shown by, or as indicated by, assuming that, owing to, given that, seeing that, the reason is that, considering that, due to the fact that, in light of, however, but when it occurs at the beginning of a sentence, and when it occurs at the beginning of a sentence.
If he's going to go on to a next page, like I said, there's a lot more difficult to parse these out, because it's not the indicators aren't as strong, but you just have to understand when people are talking, what part of the math equation are they at,
and so on. Now, when you're locating the premises of an argument, always keep in mind that the premises are supposed to be building towards the main conclusion. So having the main conclusion in mind when finding the premises will be helpful, as it'll orient your search in precisely the direction that the premises are supposed to be pointing. In short, it'll make your task both easier and more reliable. Once you've found the premises, you can then put the argument in premise-by-premise form, which is the final substep within step 2. Putting an argument in premise-by-premise form really just amounts to taking the premises you've identified, listing them in a numbered order, noting the logical connections between them if any of the premises are also sub-conclusions, and then finally listing and numbering the main conclusion afterwards with a note on the logical connection between that conclusion and the relevant premises from which it follows.
And this is just what's called the Socratic method. Just numbering the premises and then having your conclusion. That is the best way to take anything that anybody says, any claim, and put it through, put it through this this form of the Socratic method. And if they can list the premises and the conclusion, and the premises all are true and lead to the conclusion, then they're right. If not, then they're not.
So in other words, you want to construct the entire argument, start to finish, revealing its premises, its conclusion, and the logical connection between them.
Bingo!
This is also where you'll use your answer to step 2.1, wherein you determine the kind of argument at play. What kind of argument being offered dictates the form in which you should construct the argument. Now, in the rest of this section, I'll be making my points about deductive arguments specifically, but what I say generalizes quite easily to non-deductive arguments as well. So in the abstract, the goal of this fourth substep is to construct something like the following. You've got each of the premises that you've identified. You've got the main conclusion that you've identified. You've listed them in a numbered order, 1, 2, 3, 4. And next to the conclusion, you have a note here about the logical connection between the premises and the conclusion.
Right. So remember when we were talking about Melted My Media being in Indiana, there was only two premises for that one in conclusion. But the first one was that Indiana is in the United States. Second one was that I am in Indiana. And the conclusion that because I'm in Indiana and Indiana is in the United States, the conclusion, it follows that I am in the United States. Or I guess that Melty is in the United States.
In particular, you want to note from which premises the conclusion follows. This is basically just the abstract form in which you should be putting the argument. This is the premise by premise form that I'm referring to. So let's take an example here. Premise 1, if time travel is possible, then you could travel back in time and kill your grandfather before he begets one of your parents.
So remember, this is, again, the same structure as the Indiana argument. So as you're thinking about this, think about what it would be in, I just told you, but if you were to think of something else about, I'm drinking soup, I'm eating soup, then you could, anything, any claim that anybody makes could be put in this style.
Premise 2.
So if time travel is possible, then you could travel back in time and kill your grandfather before he begets one of your parents.
If you could travel back in time and kill your grandfather before he begets one of your parents, then you could bring it about that you never exist. Premise 3, but you cannot bring it about that you never exist. So this conclusion follows from 1 through 3, time travel is impossible. I'm not saying here that I accept this argument. I'm not saying here that I reject this argument. This is an example of the premise by premise form in which you should be putting your arguments.
Right. So again, we don't know whether time travel is possible or impossible at this point right now. But according to this argument, this is a sound argument. If it is true that you cannot bring about that you never exist, which seems to make sense, then there might be something else there as to why time travel doesn't exist, or why time travel does exist but you can't kill yourself, or whatever the wow, I almost said that. Good catch on my part. But it doesn't mean that's impossible. And so this is a sound argument, but it's not necessarily a valid argument.
Again, for deductive arguments. Now, note that it's pretty important to have the exact same wording between premises when the premises are intended to link together in certain ways, since otherwise there's no guarantee that a portion of one of the premises will have the same meaning as the corresponding portion in another of the premises.
Words have meanings. It is important how we use words. That is why semantically obfuscating the language is so bad. We need to understand, what are we talking about?
You want the contents of the premises, which are supposed to link up in certain logical ways, you want them to be saying the exact same thing. So really try to strive to make it such that there's the exact same wording between the premises when those premises are supposed to link up in certain ways. And by the way, an alternative and totally acceptable way to number...
Like if you just memorize this right here, if you keep this in your head at all times, whenever you're talking about anything, it'll help you out a lot in life.
Premises and conclusions could instead be something like this. Instead of doing like 1, 2, 3, 4, you can do like P for premises, C for conclusion or conclusions in the case of subconclusions, and you can kind of just number them like that. So you have P1 for the premise, P2 for the premise, and so on, and then C for the conclusion. And again, note that sometimes there will be an intermediate conclusion or sub-conclusion, which serves also as a premise that, together with other premises, leads to the ultimate conclusion.
Again, so we were talking about the trans argument, where a sub-conclusion could be that gender is a social construct that can be changed, is not tied to biology. You could make the argument that premise one, men and women, or not all men, look exactly the same. Premise two, some men look more like women than other men. Then your sub-conclusion could be that therefore you don't have to be, the sex you were born. Then the fourth premise could be, I don't want to be the sex that I was born. Then the conclusion being, I'm a woman. It works for everything. It works for everything.
That would look something like this. You got premise, sub-conclusion, and you want to make a note about the premises from which the sub-conclusion follows. Then you have a further premise, say, maybe even extra premises, maybe even further sub-conclusions, etc. And then ultimately you have the main conclusion. And again, note from which lines the conclusion follows. Here's an example of that. 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, so the universe has a cause. 4, if the universe has a cause, then God exists. 5, so God exists. And of course, here's...
Oh, come on. So obviously, as soon as I saw God on the screen, you knew this was perfect for me. So we can attack this argument just on its face. So what is it? What does it say? So the premise one: whatever begins to exist has to have a cause. So that's a claim right there. That is all something that is taken before we even start the argument. But so that's the first premise. Second premise is the universe began to exist. Kind of another claim. 3, a sub-conclusion coming from 2 premises that we can pick into. How do you know that there's that whatever begins has a cause? How do you know that the universe had a beginning? And so we can get into these things further, but you have to be able to pick out, you have to be able to see it like this in your mind before you're able to think of it in that way.
4, if the universe has a cause, then God exists. 5, so God exists. And of course, here's an obligatory shout out to my Kalam playlist. This argument here is called the Kalam cosmological argument, and I've explored every nook and cranny of that argument in extraordinary detail in this playlist. So I highly recommend checking it out for those interested.
We actually did. We covered one of, I don't know if it was just when he was starting. I didn't realize I forget exactly the structure, but when he first started that playlist, the plan was to go through the whole thing. And I guess it kind of got away from me. 37 videos now. I don't know how long it would take to go through that. But it was just, again, this stuff isn't as fun as, 2 people on a red pill podcast yelling at each other and all that stuff. But it's important. It's important that we understand this stuff.
And again, we can number things in different ways, such as the following, right? P1 for a premise, P2 for the premise, C1 for a sub-conclusion, and then note which premises the sub-conclusion follows from. Add another premise like P3, and then you have the main conclusion, which is C2, right? Because you had C1 here, you have C2 here, and you can say which lines the main conclusion follows from. It follows from that sub-conclusion here, together with premise 3. See, this should be saying P3. Now, sometimes it'll be pretty easy to put an argument in premise by premise form, since sometimes the author or speaker does it for you. Even then, though, authors usually offer sub-arguments for the premises in their main argument, and oftentimes these aren't laid bare in premise by premise form. So even when the author puts their main argument in premise by premise form, work may still need to be done in putting their justifications for their main premises in premise by premise form.
That's what I was just saying about the premises in the Kalam cosmological argument being that the universe or anything that exists has a beginning, and the universe had a beginning. Those are premises that are actually conclusions. And so that's why that gets so difficult and heady to have those kind of conversations, because then you got to break down this, and then that establishes a bunch of more of subclaims that are being presented as premises. Then you got to go a step back further and further and further until you're all the way back at Rene Descartes. And I don't know that anything exists except myself, because I'm thinking something. That's all I know that I know.
With those main premises as the conclusions of these further sub-arguments. I know, it's kind of like argumentception. And when the author doesn't put their argument in premise by premise form, it's then your task to faithfully and clearly present it in that form. Sometimes the author will leave steps implicit, and one of your important tasks is to charitably formulate those implicit steps in the most plausible or least implausible manner, while still being maximally faithful to the author's original argument/intentions. So when you are putting an author's argument in premise by premise form, and when the author leaves some steps implicit that you have to construct, again, just be guided by the principle of charity. Formulate those implicit steps in the most plausible or least implausible manner while remaining faithful as best as you can to authorial intent.
And the other thing about, this list and this way of numbering and stuff like that, you rarely are going to be sitting down and unless you're in a philosophy class, going to have to list it out like this. But again, it's important to think of it this way. And so that's why I'm hesitant to keep the captions off, because we're talking about so many different things. But I want you guys to focus on the visuals, because again, when you're having these discussions, this is what I want your mind's eye to see.
Now, once the argument is formulated in premise by premise style, you can proceed to the juicy stuff, beginning with step 3, determine whether the conclusion follows. Now, the goal of this step is to determine whether the argument's conclusion follows from its premises. The central question here is, given the truth of the premises, does the truth of the conclusion thereby follow?
So that sentence, given the truth of the premises, does the truth of the conclusion thereby follow? That doesn't mean that if all the premises are true, then the conclusion is true. What that means is, if we are to say all of the premises, if they are true, does the truth of the conclusion thereby follow? Not that because they follow that they are true, just if they are true.
Here again is where the kind of argument at play is pretty important. In the case of a deductive argument, step 3 consists in checking for validity. Remember, in deductive arguments, the truth of the premises is supposed to guarantee the truth of the conclusion. A deductive argument is valid when that condition really is met. That is, when the premises, if true, really do guarantee or logically entail the conclusion. In other words, in a valid deductive argument, it cannot be the case, in principle, that all the premises are true while the conclusion is false. In other words, there's no way for the premises to be true while the conclusion is false.
Mm-hmm.
In still other words, the conjunction right here is inconsistent. This, by the way, is the conjunction of the premises together with the denial of the conclusion, right? So we have P1, that's the first premise, and P2, that's the second premise, and P3, that's the third premise, and so on through Pn, and the negation of the conclusion, that is the denial of the conclusion. So a conjunction is just a claim of the form P and Q, and it could be arbitrarily long, so P and Q and R and S and etc. So the conjunction of premise 1 and premise 2 and premise 3 and etc. and the denial of the conclusion, that conjunction is inconsistent. It entails a strict contradiction. Again, these are all just equivalent ways of capturing validity. And then finally, in still further words, if all the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true.
So that's where we get that's why I stopped it there, because if we do determine that the premises are true, then okay, then in a deductive argument, then the conclusion comes true. But just because you have premises that would logically lead to the conclusion doesn't mean that they are true. So okay, let's give an example of that. So if we say all dogs are black, and Morty is a dog, therefore Morty is black. Well, Morty is black, but the problem with that argument or that conjunction is that not all dog. The first premise is incorrect. So it's sound logic, but it's not a valid argument, because the truth of the premises has to be there, and not all dogs are black.
This is what validity amounts to. These are all equivalent, or at least approximately equivalent, ways of capturing validity. At this point, though, I think you get the point. By contrast, in an invalid deductive argument...
And please, guys, if there's questions you guys have, let me know. If you don't understand something, if you want to challenge me on something, please let me know. Comment.
These equivalent conditions are not met. Even supposing that all the premises are true, it may still be the case, in principle, that the conclusion is false, right? It isn't logically inconsistent to affirm all the premises while denying the conclusion. That's what characterizes invalid deductive arguments. What about non-deductive arguments, you ask? Well, for non-deductive arguments, the notion analogous to validity is called strength.
So this is the part where the deductive argument is straight up, this is true as long as these are true. The non-deductive argument is, again, checking for strength and that the strength of that probably. So again, in a scientific study, the probably is going to be a lot stronger the larger the sample size, and of course, the better techniques, the better methodologies, stuff like that. But the strength of the argument is what you're looking for.
And so step 3 for non-deductive arguments consists in checking for strength. Strength here is a technical term. In a strong non-deductive argument, the premises, if true, really do probabilistically support the conclusion, though they don't logically guarantee it, of course, right? Because it's a non-deductive argument. That is, if all the premises are true, then the conclusion is thereby rendered probable, or at least thereby gains a boost in its probability, right? Which standard should be used will depend on the kind of non-deductive argument at play, and in particular, whether the premises are meant to make the conclusion probable, or whether they're merely meant to increase its probability. So, in a strong, non-deductive argument, the conclusion does, in fact, probabilistically follow from the premises. The premises, if true, probabilistically support the conclusion.
Again, so if we're taking an argument here about Christians, let's say in a non-deductive argument. So remember, this is the observed part. So all observed Christians say they believe in God. So probably all Christians believe in God. That's a pretty good assumption. That's a strong argument to make.
Right, so to assess strength and validity, you first ask, if the premises are true, right? So assuming the premises are true, does the conclusion thereby logically follow in the case of deductive arguments, or does it probabilistically follow in the case of non-deductive arguments? By the way, a non-deductive argument that isn't strong is said to be weak. So in a weak non-deductive argument, it's not the case that the premises, if true, probabilistically support the conclusion. In other words, even assuming that the premises are true, the conclusion isn't thereby rendered probable, or alternatively, isn't thereby increased in likelihood. So here's a brief summary of step 3, which again at a broad level is just determining whether the conclusion follows from the premises.
And basically the entire argument, discussion part of it itself is step 3 here.
For deductive arguments, check for validity. The truth of the premises should logically guarantee the truth of the conclusion.
Mm-hmm. So again, in a deductive argument, that's if I'm in Indiana is in the United States. Premise 1. Premise 2 is I am in Indiana. Why is that so hard to say? I'm in Indiana. The conclusion is therefore I am in the United States. So as long as the premises are true, then the conclusion can't be false. But in the non-deductive argument about dogs, then we again still have to check all of the premises. All dogs are black. Morty is black, therefore Morty is a dog. Now all 3 of those are not true, or even before we get there, the 2 premises, one of the premises isn't true. So even if the logic makes sense, it's not valid because it's not true.
For non-deductive arguments, check for strength. The truth of the premises should probabilistically support the truth of the conclusion. In each of these cases, we can speak of the conclusion deductively or probabilistically following from the premises. Right? In a valid deductive argument, the conclusion deductively follows from the premises. And in a strong non-deductive argument, the conclusion probabilistically follows from the premises. Right? That's why I summed up the 3rd step as checking whether the conclusion follows.
Mm-hmm.
Finally, notice that validity and strength are purely formal or structural features of arguments. We're not yet considering the precise content of the premises, like whether they're true or justified or what have you. Instead, we're looking at the abstract form of the argument and asking, if the premises are true, does the conclusion then follow from them? Right? This is a function not of the precise content of the premises, but instead of the abstract structural relationship between the premises and the conclusion.
So like in a straight like arithmetic equation, how did you get down there already? in a mathematical equation, then numbers are going to be numbers. I mean, unless you're talking about algebraic and higher, then 2 plus 2 is always going to equal 4. But when you start adding variables in there, then it changes, and the more variables you add, the more you have to check on, and it's important to keep this structure in mind.
Once we've ensured that the form or structure of the argument is good, we can then proceed to examine its content, which brings us to the next few steps, beginning with step 4, examine each premise's justification.
And that just means, is it right?
So in this step, you need to examine whether the premises in the argument are justified. In short, you want to proceed through each premise and ask whether there's good reason to think it's true. In particular, for each premise, systematically proceed through the following. First, determine whether reasons for the premise are even presented. If one or more reasons are presented on behalf of the premise, then to assess these reasons, you need to follow a 3-step process. First, assess the epistemic merits of the reasons. Second, assess the connection between the reasons and the premise that they're offered in support of. And third, assess the dialectical merits of the reasons. So let's get on to the first step of that process, which is to assess the epistemic merits of the reasons themselves.
Again, does this make sense? Or is it true?
Epistemic comes from the Greek word episteme, which means knowledge. And what I'm really getting at when I use the epistemic merits of the reasons themselves are the following questions that you need to ask.
How do you know that?
First, are those reasons justified? Are they themselves justified? Or are they just bare assertions in need of justification, but for which no justification is offered?
In other words, how do you know that? Or are you just saying things?
Ask things like, are they plausible? Do they rest on implicit assumptions in need of justification? Do the reasons conflict with other things that we're justified in accepting? And in addition to asking whether the reasons are justified, also ask, of course, directly, are they true? So all of these are falling under the heading of assessing the epistemic merits of the reasons themselves. The second step is to assess the connection between the reasons and the premise that they're offered on behalf of. Here we're asking, do the reasons actually justify the premise? Do they actually support or lend credence to it? Would the reasons only support the premise with the addition of an implicit linking claim? For example, if the consideration cited in support of the premise isn't obviously relevant to it, well then a linking premise might be needed which says that if that consideration is true, then the relevant premise is true. And when this is the case, when the reasons only support the premise with the addition of an implicit linking claim or claims, well then you can ask, is that claim or are those claims justified? Also ask, does the premise really follow from the reasons offered on its behalf? And if the reasons are supposed to only probabilistically support the premise, do they actually make the premise probable?
Again, this is the discussion part of the argument. This is the actual debate part. And so this is what you're trying to do when you're having a conversation with somebody, when you're having a debate with someone. You're going through, and when they present you with an argument, you're able to filter that in your mind into that premise, conclusion, structure. Then you can go do this. Okay, do all the reasons actually justify the premise? Do they actually support or lend credence to it? So on and so forth. And at any point, if you're like, wait a minute, no, that doesn't actually justify the premise. So you said that all dogs are black, but that's not actually true. And then you can talk about that.
So notice that all of these aren't directly assessing the epistemic merits of the reason, right? That's what we did in step 4.1. Instead, we're assessing how that reason or how those reasons that the person offers for the premise connect up with that premise. Do they actually justify it? Do they lend credence to it? Would they only support the premise with the addition of some other claim or claims? Does the premise really follow from them, whether deductively or probabilistically? And so on. These are all about the connection or the relationship between the reasons and the premise for which those reasons are offered.
Or another way to think about it is just telling the story of your conclusion. Especially in politics, it's very easy to see, well, okay, go chronologically. Well, this happened back in, the 90s, and then this happened in the early 2000s that led to this, and that happened, and that, and you can come to your conclusion that way. But you have to be able to, again, fit this structure in your mind.
Now, I think it'll be helpful here to illustrate this second step behind examining a premise's justification. Suppose you and your spouse are renovating your kitchen, and suppose you go to a local kitchen designer with various kitchen displays at their store.
Okay, so again, remember, you guys know what I say about people who can't handle hypotheticals. The problem with them understanding the hypothetical is that they don't have the ability to put the hypothetical in that structure that we've been talking about. So this is, this is a perfect test of whether or not you understand what we're actually talking about. So let's go back to the beginning here.
Examining a premise's justification. Suppose you and your spouse are renovating your kitchen, and suppose you go to a local kitchen designer with various kitchen displays at their store.
Okay.
You look at one of the kitchen displays, and the walls in the display appear yellow. Your spouse wants to model your kitchen on this display, but you remember that one of your kids has a pathological fear of yellow walls. You try to convince your spouse not to model the kitchen on this display by using the following argument.
Okay, so these are the two. There's two premises and the conclusion.
1. The walls in the display are yellow, and you cite their appearance as the reason favoring this premise. 2. If the walls in the display are yellow, then if we model our kitchen on the display, we'll trigger our child's fear. 3. So if we model our kitchen on the display, we'll trigger our child's fear.
So then we can have the if this was going to be a real argument, then we would then question the premises. Like, okay, are the walls in fact yellow? Well, actually, I think they're more of a sea green. Well, you're colorblind, so we're gonna go with yellow. Okay, number one is good. If the walls if the walls are yellow and we model our kitchen, then we will trigger our child's fear. Now, that's a little bit different than just is this yellow or is this not yellow? So then you might have the conversation about how that's going to work out, and you can use a more probabilistic answer that every time this kid's seen yellow before, he freaked the F out. So I don't know why you would think things would be any different if you want him to wake up to that every day. So it would trigger the child's fear. And so the conclusion, if we model our kitchen on this display, will trigger our child's fear, is true. Then you can come up with the counter argument that, well, we can't have a child that's running around the world afraid of the color yellow. So maybe the best possible thing for this kid is to put yellow all around him. Every morning he's got to sit down in the kitchen and see those yellow walls and so on and so forth. But you can't make these arguments if you don't understand this structure. If you don't understand the structure, it's not going to work.
And since you both want to avoid triggering that fear, you conclude that you shouldn't model the kitchen on the display. Your spouse, however, isn't convinced by your argument. They point out that the lights in the store were yellow-tinted lights.
As soon as I got through step one, I was like, okay, this is exactly what we need to be talking about. I haven't watched any of the rest of this. So if this comes up and says the exact same thing, then I am a baller.
It says so on the website, and the store owner confirmed this over the phone. As a result, the lights make any light-colored wall appear yellow, including light-colored walls that aren't actually yellow.
So this goes back to, again, justifying the premises. I used the colorblind argument, but the spouse now is saying, no, that's the lighting. The walls aren't actually yellow. In our house, the lighting is going to be different.
So, your spouse reasons, your first premise is unjustified, since the wall may very well be white, or light blue, or beige, or any other light color, even though it appears yellow. Since there isn't any antecedent reason to expect the wall to be yellow as opposed to any other light color, and since any other light color would equally result in the wall appearing yellow given the yellow-tinted lights, we are unjustified in concluding that the wall is yellow just on the basis of its appearance. Here, your spouse has offered a pretty good reason to think that your first premise is unjustified. Importantly, your spouse hasn't shown that the wall isn't yellow, right? For all they've said, the wall might still be yellow.
Yep.
The point, though, is that your spouse has removed the justification for thinking that the wall is yellow. It's another thing entirely to go on to show that the wall isn't yellow, which your spouse hasn't done here.
Right. If they were able to say, no, actually, it's just the display. This is the actual color it will be, and it was, something completely different, then we would have, a perfect undercutting of that argument. But it was just the lights.
And this, by the way, maps onto an important philosophical distinction between undercutting defeaters and rebutting defeaters. Now, these are oftentimes used differently by different philosophers, so when they come up in conversations, it's helpful to give a brief characterization of what you mean by them when you're using those terms. But here's a gloss on relatively popular and relatively standard usages within philosophy. So an undercutting defeater for a claim is some consideration that removes or undercuts or undermines the justification for that claim.
Again, so if the whole premise is that the walls are in fact yellow, introducing the idea of the lights undercuts that.
It targets the connection between the claim and the reason or reasons offered on that claim's behalf, showing that the claim isn't adequately supported by the reasons. By contrast, a rebutting defeater for a claim is a reason to think that the claim is false. It directly targets the claim itself,
So that would be, again, like showing that you are in fact colorblind and the walls are actually green.
And provides grounds for thinking that that claim is false. Right? In the above example, your spouse only offered an undercutting defeater for your first premise. Right? They didn't give a reason to think that the premise is false, but rather they just gave a reason to think it was unjustified by challenging the support offered on its behalf. So overall, it's pretty important to examine the connection between the reason or reasons and the premise that they're meant to support. And that, you will recall, is the second step within our three-step process behind step 4. Onwards we march, though, to the third step within this three-step process, and that third step is to assess the dialectical merits of the reasons. Whereas in the first step, you assess the epistemic merits of the reasons, and the second step, you assess the connection between the reasons and the premise. Here you are assessing the dialectical merits of the reasons. A dialectic, by the way, is just a kind of argumentative context or environment. Assessing the dialectical merits of the reasons, then, will amount to assessing how appropriate they are in the relevant argumentative context.
Yeah, if you come across anybody that is unironically using dialectical merits or even a dialectic, that's not really the way people talk. So that's a key that you're talking to somebody who everything they know comes from a book and not actual lived experience.
So we're asking things like, are the reasons question begging? Do the reasons beg the question in the context at hand? That is, do the reasons presuppose the truth of the very premise they're supposed to support? Or do they presuppose the truth of the ultimate conclusion that the main argument is meant to support? Would one already have to accept the relevant premise or conclusion in order to be justified in accepting the reason offered on behalf of that premise? If these sorts of conditions are met, then the reason is simply question begging in the relevant context. Of course, it's also worth asking directly whether any premise in the original argument begs the question.
And so begging the question is a logical fallacy that will essentially create a question that you're trying to answer with the answer. So I used to have a great example of this. Begging the question would be like if I want to climb up on the roof, then I need to use something that will get me up there. Right? That begs the question, what should I use to get up there?
Ask yourself, is it the case that only those who already accept the conclusion would be in a position to accept the premise? In order to justifiably accept the premise, would you already have to accept the conclusion? When these sorts of conditions hold, the premise, or the arguer proposing the premise, is said to beg the question.
I'm trying to think. I might be confusing that with raising the question. Because begging the question is something very specific. Let's see if he gets into it.
In begging the question, one assumes the truth of the very thing one is trying to support. Also ask within this third step whether the reasons illicitly shift the burden of proof, which is another notable dialectical infelicity. Ask, do the offered reasons illegitimately shift the burden of proof away from the proponent of the argument and onto the argument's detractor? Here's
Okay, perfect. We got an example.
an example to illustrate this sort of mistake.
And we're going back to God.
Smith says, here's an argument for God's existence. 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, if the universe has a cause, then God exists. 4, conclusions, how God exists.
And of course, our boy Jones comes in and is playing the part of the Indian Jesus. Why should we accept premise 1?
Jones says to Smith, well, why should we accept that first premise? To which Smith responds, well, why on earth should we think that something can begin to exist without a cause? Notice here that Smith has illicitly shifted the burden of proof onto the one who isn't convinced that one of his premises is true.
So originally, Smith is the one making the claim. So the burden of proof is on Smith. So Jones now hasn't made any claims and is just questioning the conclusion that Smith has come up with, that God exists. And then Smith says, well, why on earth shouldn't we think that something can begin to exist without a cause? Like, I never said that it could. I'm just asking you why you know that whatever begins to exist has to have a cause. How do you know that that's the case? I don't know that it is or it isn't.
But the onus is on Smith to positively establish the truth of his premise. The onus isn't on the recipient of the argument to positively establish that one of Smith's premises is false. If Smith doesn't actually roll up his sleeves and give us some non-burden shifting reason to accept his premise, then he simply failed to make his case for his conclusion.
That pretty much sums up every argument about God that I've had in the last 15 years. Shifting the burden of proof, moving the goalpost, straw manning my argument, no true Scotsman fallacy. All of these things have been used, and they're not reasonable. They're in fact the direct opposite. They're logically fallacious.
So anyway, that's another dialectical infelicity to be aware of and to look out for. Within this third step, you should also ask whether the reasons offered on behalf of the relevant premise conflict with other parts of the argument, such as other premises, or the main conclusion, or other reasons offered on behalf of premises. And ask, do the reasons equally support a claim incompatible with the premise that they're meant to support? And also, do they equally support a claim incompatible with something else in the argument? If the answer is yes to either of these, that's yet another dialectical problem for the argument at hand. The reason or reasons offered on behalf of one of the premises either fail to support that premise because they equally support a claim incompatible with the premise, or you've got a problem for the overarching argument because those reasons equally support a claim incompatible with something else in the argument, say the main conclusion, or say some other premise.
Right. All right, so here's where we're going, guys. So nobody said they learned anything new, and nobody's talking. We're not really partying, so we're gonna finish up this this step. And if you want me to continue or do another part of this, then we can do that. But I don't want to waste your guys' time, so let's just finish this up.
Here's some examples of this. For example, in the case of the Kalam cosmological argument's causal principle, the principle that says that whatever begins to exist has a cause, someone might offer a reason to accept that principle, deriving from our universal experience of beginnings having causes. But crucially, our universal experience equally supports other principles incompatible with the very traditional theism that serves as the ultimate conclusion of the Kalam. One such principle would be the principle that every material thing that begins to exist has a material cause in the sense of things or stuff from which it's made. For more on this sort of point, you can see my video on the Kalam's causal principle. A similar thing often occurs with the possibility premise in the modal ontological argument. According to that premise, it's possible that God exists. Oftentimes, someone will offer a reason to accept that premise, which equally supports the reverse possibility premise, that it's possible that God doesn't exist. Holding fixed the other portions of the modal ontological argument, these two possibility premises are actually incompatible with one another. And so in order to justify only one of them, one needs to offer a reason for it that doesn't equally favor the other incompatible premise.
So basically, both of these arguments are just as good at proving the thing that they want to prove, as well as disproving the thing that they don't want to prove for whichever position you take. So they have weight to them, but it's kind of undercut by the other argument.
For more on this sort of point, see my videos here on the screen. A user's guide to the modal ontological argument and ontological arguments from Anselm to Gödel. Now, there are other questions to consider in assessing the reasons that someone offers on behalf of a premise, but covering all of them would literally take dozens upon dozens of hours. My goal here has simply been to give a helpful glimpse into some of the most important questions that you should be asking. Anyway, again, right now I'm taking you through the three-step thought process behind examining the reasons offered on behalf of a given premise. We first determine whether reasons for the premise are even presented. If one or more reasons are presented, then you should follow that three-step thought process just outlined. But if reasons aren't presented, you need to determine whether reasons are needed. If they're not, then it's not really problematic that reasons aren't presented. Reasons may not be needed for a premise when, for instance, the premise is definitionally true, or obvious, or granted by all parties to the dispute. Or when the purpose of the argument isn't to persuade others or to support the conclusion, but instead to, say, clarify a debate or show a consequence of a set of claims. Importantly, though, when conditions like this aren't met, when the premise isn't definitionally true, when it isn't obvious, when it isn't granted by all parties to the dispute, and when the purpose of the argument is to persuade or to support the conclusion, then some reason for the premise is probably needed.
And so basically that all just comes down to the idea that if you are going to say something, then you have to understand whether there is room for somebody to push back on that. So if they're determining whether reasons are needed. If they're not, then you're all good. But If they do, then you can't go forward in the conversation before you deal with the reasons behind the premises that you're talking about. You need to get past that before you try to get to the main conclusion.
And if some premise is needed but not presented, then congratulations, you found a flaw in the argument. So then we have the following chart you should use to implement our fourth step in analyzing arguments. And again, the fourth overarching step is to determine whether the premises of the argument are justified. So here's our handy dandy table. On the top, we've got some reason is needed versus no reason is needed. And on the left, we've got some reason is presented versus no reason is presented. Now, if some reason is needed, well, then if some reason is presented, well, then just follow that three-step thought process.
So basically, if we're, let's say we're in the middle of a discussion, and your main conclusion is that God exists, and my main, my position is just simply that I don't accept that. And you start with the cosmological argument, and you say everything has to have a beginning. So then, we go to some reason is needed. So we'd go down, and if there is no reason at all to think that the universe had a beginning, well, that's a flaw in the argument. Now, that's not necessarily the case. So we can go back up through the three-step process, the Socratic method, and flesh out those reasons and see if we agree on those premises and those conclusions before we move on. But if we can't, or if there is no logical reason behind why somebody is making the premise, that's a flaw in the argument. You win. Like, you're wrong. You're wrong. But obviously, if you're trying to have a fruitful conversation, you might want to be a little bit nicer about it. But then obviously, if not, then, you just keep on going with the conversation.
If some reason is needed, but no reason is presented, well, then you found a flaw in the argument. If no reason is needed, but some reason is presented nevertheless, well, then if time and space permit, you can follow that three-step thought process. It's not going to hurt to examine that reason or the.
And that's basically just saying that you don't necessarily need to get into this, but if somebody is, let's say we're talking about, let's just keep the God argument, and we're talking about, your specific church. Then, you don't I don't need a reason as to why your particular church is an authority on Christianity, but we could certainly talk about it. But it's not going to stop the conversation from being productive if we don't talk about your specific church.
Those reasons, even though they aren't needed. But if time and space don't permit, or if it doesn't seem appropriate, you can just proceed on to step 5, which is what we're going to cover next in the video. And finally, if no reason is needed and no reason is presented, well then again, just proceed to step 5. So then, once you've faithfully followed this chart with due care and requisite depth, you can proceed on to step 5.
All right. So, I guess you guys, this isn't up your alley too much. I guess we'll have to stick more with some of the stuff that you guys have been responding to. Got to try new stuff. I'm sorry it wasn't really up your alley, but I very much appreciate you guys hanging out. And big shout out to Unwanted Foe for sponsoring the stream. Thank you so much. Greatly appreciated. And, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? So, I'm going to keep trying to find new stuff. I'm a little deflated. I really thought this, be able to have some fun here, but apparently not. But that is all right. As long as you guys are not entertained, then I won't shove this BS down your throat, but we'll find something new. So thank you so much. Of course, Kelly Green at the last minute. Welcome to the party as it is ending. Nobody was having fun, so we are just going to end it here. But thank you so much, guys. I do appreciate you. Can't all be winners, right? Until next time, this has been Morty, and I have been your host, Lutch, a.k.a. the Indian Jesus, here to resurrect the second coming of common sense. Until next time, we are out of here. Peace.